welcome you to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. And today we're going to be looking at Job's final statement, the last word. And it's over 3 chapters, 29, 30, and 31. At the end of 31, in verse 40, at the end of verse 40, it said the words of Job are ended. And so that's his final speech before the Lord intervenes to speak to him in the last chapters of the book that we'll look at too. But his final statement that expresses his perplexity at all that's happened to him is listed here beginning in 29. And it continues what we've looked at already in 27 and 28. This is a part of it, but this is really his formal statement. And 29 begins with his reflection on the life he had, which is the life we more or less expect to be characteristic of a righteous man. And he was exceedingly righteous, and so he had an exceedingly great honor that was attributed to him. But when we come to chapter 31 or 30, he begins it with but. I mean, the first chapter describes the blessings he had under the favor of God. And then in chapter 30, he describes the lamentable condition he is in now with all the things that have happened to him. And the most perplexing thing of all is he doesn't know of any unrighteousness that he's done to merit such a thing. So if there is any flaw, it's probably in his understanding of grace alone in terms of sanctification and life. But the Lord doesn't seem to attribute that as we get to the Lord's response to all of his suffering that is outlined for us in chapter 30. The Lord will basically tell him that he doesn't understand everything, and that is the way that we understand that the circumstances of life cannot be attributed in whole to living well or not. But chapter 29 is retrospective. We'll look at that today. That's looking back at the favor of God over his house. And chapter 30 looks at the miserable present condition. And then coming out of that, his final word is in chapter 31. And that's where he takes all of these oaths. He examines every aspect and department of his life and concludes that, and he gives the motivation for why he preserved his integrity, why he tried to walk in the way of righteousness. And that heightens his perplexity. And then he speaks to the Lord at the very end and hands it over and finishes his case. So these last 3 chapters really are a unit within a unit, because they look at his final argument as he's trying to sharpen the case that he has, not against God, but in front of God. He doesn't understand why these circumstances align the way they do any longer. So we'll look at 29 today. I'm going to break it into 3 parts because they're very emotive and they require reflection to fully comprehend the extent of what he's undergoing. So chapter 29, Job further continued his discourse and said, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me." The language is really evocative here. He's longing for the past before his trial of all the evil that came against him had begun. And he said he felt the favor of God, that God was watching over him. It's very tender, but poignant in light of his circumstances now. He said, "When his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness." The Bible has much to say about that metaphor of walking in his light so that we don't stumble in the darkness and don't fall. But Job had not only stumbled, he had fallen, and yet the light was still bright around him. So he can't comprehend these things. He says, "Just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent. A beautiful statement of the favor of the Lord. His counsel, God's counsel, he would seek God's wisdom, and he would walk in the days of his strength, he says, when the Almighty was yet with me. And so he obviously feels that God has abandoned him, has forsaken him. When my children were around me, now his children are now dead, as we know, because of this present trial. Verse 6, he says, when my steps were bathed with, I'm going to retranslate this because there is a confusion in the Hebrew text. The Masoretic text reads malah. It sounds the same in English, and they read that as wrath. But and there is a division among the Hebrew text. There is another word, malah. There is a consonantal difference, which is why it has some significance between a hey and an aleph. But the other word is milk, and I think that's the one to be preferred. The Septuagint reads another Hebrew tradition, textual tradition, and it's the same. They translate it here, when my steps are bathed with cream, and that I think is essentially the same, and I agree with that. It's not the reading of the Masoretic text, but I prefer saying butter because it's derived from milk, and I like the alliteration in any case. When my steps were bathed with butter, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. And so the oil then parallels the butter. These luxuries, actually, culinary luxuries. And he says the rock poured out rivers of oil. That's highly ironic because oil doesn't come from the rock. Water, we know, in Moses can come from the rock, but rivers of oil, he heightens it. In each verse is a parallelism in poetry, and the emphasis is always on the second strophe. So there are two strophes. When my steps were bathed with butter, and the rock poured out rivers of oil for me. That's the characterization, the rich characterization he gives to his life before this trial began. He says, when I went out to the gate of the city. Now, the gate of the city is not just an entryway. It's the place where all the transactions that were relevant in the city took place. The council of the elders would meet at the city gate. It's the place where it was like a court of records. Any kind of conveyance of property would be done in the presence of witnesses before the gate. And so he says, when he went into the gate of the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged arose and stood. He's saying he was given respect by every generation. He was so much a matter of awe in the community that the young people fled from him. And the old people, who are known or should be known for wisdom, typically that's associated with age in the Bible. The aged arose and stood out of respect for his far exceeding everyone in wisdom. He says, the princes restrained from talking and put their hand on their mouth. I referenced that in light of Isaiah 52, where the kings, it is said, it's very similar, would shut their mouths. They would square their fingers and put them over their mouths to say, we have nothing to say in this context, because wisdom will be speaking when Job speaks. And so they have nothing, the princes have nothing to say. In Isaiah 52, it's used of the Messiah, the Christ, the servant of the Lord. And there it says, kings will shut their mouths before him. That is, his wisdom will be so extraordinary and exemplary that even the most powerful will have nothing to say, nothing to add and nothing to take from. So the princes restrained from talking and put their hand on my mouth. The voice of nobles was hushed. So he's talking here about class. These are typically wealthy landowners, the patrician class. He says nobles. Their voice was hushed and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. They had nothing to say. They didn't even seek for anything to say when he was present, because wisdom was his, and it was acknowledged by everyone. He says, when the ear heard, then it blessed me, and when the eye saw, then it approved me. When he did speak, and they saw what he was saying, they blessed him. And when the ear heard, it blessed him, and when the eye saw, it approved of him. They always agreed to his counsel in the matters of the city, in political matters. Why? Why did they always listen to him? Because of his character. And his character is characterized by his kindness to the poor and the other people who have less status than he does. He says, because they did this because I delivered the poor who cried out, and the fatherless, and the one who had no helper. So he delivered the poor. He was not blind to the status and the lack of anyone's ability to help him, to pay him back, or to reward him in any way. That was not accounted when it came to justice. He would do what was right. The fatherless, the orphan, and the one who had no helper. The blessing of the perishing man came upon me. This is really remarkable. The one who was dying spoke of him with blessing, because he would seek out to do whatever he could to comfort them. And I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. That's beautiful poetry here. The widow's heart is known for inconsolable grief, and he would cause the widow's heart to sing for joy, to sing, which is so contrary to nature, for joy, because he would clearly he would offer her consolation and support, and she would not be doomed to destitution. He says, I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. These are beautiful images of his righteousness. He wore them like splendid garments at the court, in the public eye. But what really clothed him was righteousness and justice. These attributes of a judge that we should all desire. They were like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind, he said. I was feet to the lame. Very practical, I think he's saying, because the blind always walks in darkness and fears stumbling and others taking advantage of him. So he would be foresightful, and he would accommodate the infirmity of someone else that is notably weakened by some kind of disability. He says, I was feet to the lame. So he supplied that which was lost to the ones who were needy, to these that are in some kind of disability. He would seek to remedy what couldn't be remedied physically. He says, I was a father to the poor, and I searched out a case that I did not know. So all of these are people who can't help him. They can't give him anything in return, so he's not looking for any reward other than the favor of God. The father to the poor, what can the poor have to offer in a time of need? What could they offer to Job? He says, I searched out the case that I did not know. If a matter came before him, and remember he's in the gate as one of the elders, in fact the chief elder of the city, so judgments are made. If a case came before him that he did not know, what did he do? He says, I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. He would investigate it. He says, I searched out the case that I did not know. And when he had determined who the victimizer was, he says, I broke the fangs of the wicked, making a false charge against weakened people, like the serpent. I broke the fangs when he found injustice, and plucked out their teeth, the victim from his teeth. In other words, he delivered him from being devoured by wickedness. Then I said, now this is his folly, which is not according to the way that we would expect things to go. He said, then I said, I shall die in my nest. A nest is a place of protection for the vulnerable. So he said, I said, I shall die in my nest and multiply my days as the sand. He expected an unnumbered number of days to come when he would enjoy the favor of the Lord, and no difficulty. He would see no difficulty. He would die in comfort in the protection of his nest. He says, my root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lies all night on my branch. What a beautiful image that. Water is what makes vitality and fruitfulness in the desert. And these regions are desert-like. At the best, they're semi-tropical. But he said, my root is spread out to the waters, and that's important. The root system, especially in dry climates, has to find some source of water. And he says, and the dew lies all night on my branch, and that presupposes that there is moisture in the air. So it's not completely dry and desert-like. He says, my glory is fresh within me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. So his strength, the bow is the emblem of strength with a man. We can think of Odysseus when he confronts the suitors that had come to Ithaca. The bow is the emblem of strength for a man, and he says his bow was renewed, his strength was renewed all along. He says, men listened to me and waited and kept silence for my counsel. When he would come to the elders meeting in the gate, they would all become quiet and still until the case was presented to Job, and then his counsel would speak, and everyone would recognize the wisdom of it. He said, after my words they did not speak again. There's nothing to add. And my speech settled on them as dew. There was nothing to subtract. They welcomed. The wisdom was so evident. It's like wisdom in the Bible is like Solomon in his judgment seat. After God had given him a gift of extraordinary wisdom, he's able to discern between the one who is speaking truth and the one who is a liar, and the two prostitutes that come with a quarrel over the living child. And he's the inquisitor, and so he develops evidence, and he does that by threatening to be an uncaring monarch, troubled by these women. Both he knows are liars. They're both prostitutes, and in Proverbs he describes the life of a prostitute as a liar. And there's a she said. There is no way to by way of evidence to know to whom the child belongs. And so he has to create the evidence. And so he threatens to be a tyrant who is weary of being encumbered by such a small claim. And so he threatens to have the baby divided, which would speak to the division of the case. And of course that would result in the death of the child. But that threat exposes the true mother, and everyone that reads that account, or certainly everyone who was there, would know who the true mother was. That's the wisdom. Once he had decided, everybody, there was no question about to whom the child belonged. And it was the same with Job. He so spoke with such an overwhelming and divine wisdom that everyone recognized that's what we should do. So he would carry the counsel of the elders every time he spoke. After my words they did not speak again, and my speech is settled on them as dew. They waited for me as for the rain, and they opened their mouth wide as for the spring rain. So any decision that they would make would be preliminary until Job had ratified it by his own counsel. And so they waited for it. In the semi-tropical Levant, it rains during the winter months of the year and not the summer. And so in the summer you wait for the early rains that continue for 6 months until the latter rains. And the early rains usually come around October, so in the hot months of the summer, you're parched, longing for the rains to come. And so if Job is not there, it's like the summer when the dry wind comes off the Jordanian steppe. But when he arrives, it's like the early rains coming in October when the wind shifts and comes off the Mediterranean, and the wind is laden with moisture, and so the rains begin and continue till the latter rains in the spring. So they waited for me as for the rain. They opened their mouths wide as for the spring rain. If I mocked at them, they did not believe it. and the light of my countenance they did not cast down. They never attributed any kind of ill motive to him. He led such a life filled with integrity and impartiality. That's a hard thing to do, by the way, but he had that reputation. That's what he was doing, and all of that confirmed the fact that he is a righteous sufferer, not an unrighteous sufferer, suffering for his own hidden guilt. He said, I chose the way for them and sat as chief. And he said before, in the light of my countenance they did not cast down. I chose the way for them and sat as chief. He was the way. He described the way and sat as the chief elder. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts mourners. And the Lord uses that to comfort the mourning in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, verse 4. Blessed are they who mourn. And Job had anticipated that and anticipates that character of Christ. But he says he chose the way for them and sat as a chief, and he dwelt as a king in the army. That is, he had a power when he spoke that could not be contradicted. And so he as one who comforts the mourners. That's not necessarily the case with unrighteous men. They curry favor with those who can return the favor or can support them in some way, and they disregard anyone who is not useful to them. So it's a very narcissistic way of looking at things. Everything is for them. But he's living in the fear of God, and so walking in that fear, he's able to speak with power and authority. And that's the way life was for him. Next time we'll look at the way life presently is, and his lament for that found in chapter 30.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Warren Gage podcast. If you enjoyed this message, please be sure to like and subscribe to one of our channels so that you never miss an episode. We'd appreciate it if you could also leave us a review. You can find us on drwarrengage.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. To support the podcast and gain access to exclusive offers and content from Dr. Warren Gage, please visit our Patreon account at patreon.com/Dr. Warren Gage. We hope you join us next time on the Dr. Warren Gage podcast.